My name is Rob Prince. My colleague is Ibrahim Kazarouni. We have been doing these live interviews on different Middle East subjects for some time now. Um, uh, we for the last 11 years, we've had a monthly program on local public radio station, KGNU, Hemispheres, Middle East Dialogues. And that program began really with our commentaries on what was happening in Tunisia during the Arab Spring. And so here we are now, and Tunisia is in crisis once again, and we want to talk about some aspects of this crisis and how we see it and what are the hopes for the future. For those unfamiliar with Tunisia, Tunisia is a small country wedged between Libya and Algeria, two much larger oil-producing countries. Its population at the current moment is about 20 million, almost all of whom are Muslims. And it's a place that's close to my heart. Basically, many years ago, I was a Peace Corps volunteer and staff member in Tunis and Sousse. And in my teaching, I've referred to and looked at Tunisia as a kind of model for third world development or problems with that development. So with that, let's get right into the material. Ibrahim, can you tell us something briefly about Tunisia and give us a brief overview of the current crisis?
Yes, good evening to everyone.
Yes.
And I hope everyone doing well. For both of us and for those who addressed Arab Spring, Tunisia has a special place because it was the first country that the Arab Spring unpacked itself in that country that led to the departure of a tyrant within the country. And after that, somehow the Arab Spring and the movement percolated through various countries in the region, particularly to the east of Tunis, Libya and Egypt, but very little to the west, Algeria and Morocco, that has its own reason. The current crisis, one thing that led the uprising in Tunis led to the coming to power of a unique structure or a unique group of people dominated by the An-Nahda, which is Muslim Brotherhood, kind of branch in Tunis, slightly different from Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt or Muslim Brotherhood in Syria or somewhere else. Ghannouchi, he spent a large time of his life in exile in England, and then once he returned, he was able to utilize the instability that exists in Tunis and take over. His party won huge elections, and ever since he's been in charge, at least controlling the parliament. What led to the current crisis is the inability of the governments that came to power from 2011 up to now to bring in what constituted the crux of the uprising, and that was the bad socio-economic reasons. People had no job, no work, no employment, no hope, etc., and they were hoping that if they were to get rid of Ben Ali and there would be a change in the government, these issues will be addressed. Up to now, nothing happened. COVID-19 added to the crisis.
Yes.
And once Tunis used to have, I'm sure during your time, Rob, over there, you remember the health service. We have talked about it. The health service that existed in Tunis, and they all have been dismantled. We can talk about it a little bit later as to why. And the constitution that, by the way, we have to mention this, the constitution that we have today, that the president uses section 80 of the constitution as a justification for what he did, was a constitution that was agreed upon by An-Nahda and brought to, as part of the election. This is their own constitution. it allows the president to do exactly what the current president did if he sees the government or the country in crisis that need drastic step. So he has resolved parliament, dismantled or at least stopped everything, and he has promised that maximum 5 years, if not less, he's going to reorganize, restructure everything else. Later on, we are going to talk about why Tunis and few other countries in the region are in the crisis that they are in, and why is it that they have not been able to change the system and create the background to the uprising that the expectation that people had. You want to add something, Rob?
Yeah, first, you mentioned Ghannouchi, so just for our listeners, Rashid Ghannouchi is the chair of the Ennahda Party. I want to talk just briefly different aspects of the current crisis. On the one hand, there is a gridlock in the parliament, and the parliament has really not been able to function for some time, with the different factions not being able to find common ground and deal with the crisis. Just a little background on this: when Zine Ben Ali and his clique were overthrown, the new constitution was written in such a way to take power away from the president, and in fact to limit the president's power greatly, and to give most of the power in Tunisia to the parliament itself. And within the parliament, the party that really controlled it was the Ennahda Party, was Rashid Ghannouchi's party. So part of what's happening now is to change that once again and to return real decision-making power to the president and to limit the power of the parliament. But the real thing here is to challenge Ennahda. So there's a constitutional crisis. There are other aspects to the crisis as well. There's also it's really a crisis of corruption. You can't go anywhere in Tunisia, or you can't get anywhere anymore without paying someone off. And the level of corruption has reached such epidemic proportions that President Said he had to step in to try to counter.
And that is, Rob, that is exactly what happened in Egypt as well. When the Muslim Brotherhood came to power, they literally divided the country between themselves, as if there were gifts between one faction of the Brotherhood and the other. And that's exactly what happened in Tunis.
That's right.
Ghannouchi has used its majority in parliament not only just to neutralize various prime ministers and stop them from taking any action. He has literally distributed these wealth and power between his own group and clique of people. And the consequence of this, as it happened in Egypt, the consequence is a total paralysis in Tunis, and people are becoming restless. They are asking, why is it that they have so-called democracy, but democracy is not able to address real critical issues?
Well, we'll talk about that too. So these are two aspects of the crisis, and then the third aspect you just referred to, and that's this Delta variety of COVID-19, which has really hit Tunisia very, very harshly. Now, you were referring a little bit earlier to the gutting of the health sector, and this is what happened. So over the years, when I was first in Tunisia, and now we're talking about half a century ago, but I had free healthcare there. I had surgery in Tunisia, my knee, and took advantage of other services. It was really quite a decent healthcare system. What happened to the healthcare system? Essentially, what happened is, beginning in the 1980s, Tunisia was forced to accept IMF and World Bank structural adjustment programs, and a whole series of them. I'm going to come back to this because it's really key. But part of the conditions of those structural adjustment programs was cutting funding to the healthcare, among other things, to the healthcare section. So when the COVID crisis hits, we have a healthcare system that's completely unprepared to deal with the nature of this crisis. And probably, I mean, who knows, but it's pretty clear that they would have been able to deal with it far better than they have. So we have that aspect too. This is what's fueling the current crisis. However, we need to add something, and that this current crisis is just a manifestation of the deeper crisis, and that crisis has gone on for 40 years. 40, yes, pretty close to 40 years. And that crisis is basically a socio-economic crisis. It starts in the early 1980s. And what we have is every government, whether it's the Bourguiba government, the Ben Ali government, the Ennahda-led government after 2011, whatever else they have done, they have been unable to address this socio-economic crisis. So each political, if you like, group that comes to power, all they've been able to do is tinker with it. But the fundamental political economy of the country has really not changed at all.
And there is a reason. There is a reason for this, Rob, that we can go up to 1955. During the non-aligned period of 1955 to 1980, Arab countries were in the forefront of a struggle against Western hegemony and fight for freedom. The existence of the Soviet Union and bipolar system helped them in this regard. We have Boumediene in Algeria, Nasser in Egypt, and the Ba'ath Party, Aflaq in Syria, at least before it became the Ba'ath Party in Iraq and changed its dynamic. These were part of the countries and states that were considered to be the South, and they're fighting for a better future. Right. They were one-party state, no doubt about it, right. Not a democracy according to our standard, but they had a legitimacy in the eyes of the people for their achievement, mass education, health, public services, industrialization, and the employment, upward social mobility, etc., etc. By the time the Soviet Union disintegrated around 1990, and you have the new liberalism literally pushing into these countries. Instead of the leaders of these countries, instead of standing up to the Western new liberal economic system, that, by the way, in essence, is a unique understanding of economic system that works on free trade, globalization, deregulation, privatization, etc., etc., and reduction of government spending, austerity, free trade, which results in the private sector, Western private sector, in penetrating into these countries and taking over the wealth.
Yes.
What happened as a consequence, that these people, the leadership, whether it was in Iraq or any other places, they succumbed and capitulated to the Western hegemony and began to gradually dismantle all the good work that had been done from 1955 up to 1980-85.
Yes, I want to add one thing here. In the early period, which was also a period of, if you like, growth in the global economy, which begins to slow around the early 1980s. And I forget the year, I think it was 83 or 84, there were in Tunisia what is referred to as the bread riots. And what the bread riots were a response to the then Bourguiba administration being pressured to take an IMF structural adjustment loan. And at first, Bourguiba agreed. And then the demonstrations on the street were so angry and so violent that after a couple of days, he backed off. All right. So he refused to accept this agreement. Well, what happened to Bourguiba? A few years later, he is removed in what's called a, quote, a medical coup. They said he was incapable of ruling anymore. It's possible that that's true. But having said that, Ben Ali comes along, opens up the dialogue in the country a little bit. But basically, what Ben Ali does is Ben Ali almost from the get-go says, "Okay, we will accept the IMF structural adjustment terms." And in fact, since that time, whether it's the Ben Ali regime or whether it's the Ennahda government from 2011, one structural adjustment program after another, a deepening of the socio-economic crisis in the country. So, right now, people, how is the discussion being framed about Tunisia? If reading the New York Times or mainstream media in general, both here and in Europe, it's somehow a struggle between, quote, authoritarianism on the one hand and democracy on the other. And I want to read you just a quote from a Tunisian friend of mine. So one of the publications that I wrote for years, I don't write for them anymore, but I did. It was called nawat.org, and it was an award-winning human rights website. And its founder is named Sami Ben Gardaya. And Sami made a comment today on social media, and I want to read it and ask for your comments on it. No, it's not a coup. It was the only legal and broadly constitutional move to solve the country's crisis. The 2014 Constitution and the Electoral Code were drafted in a way to maintain Ennahda Islamicist party's grip on power. They supported corruption and built a new, fully crony political system. Saying that, of course, we need to remain vigilant and counter any autocratic attempts. Tunisia is not Egypt, and Said is not Sisi. Okay. Anyhow, he's really responding to this notion that what we're seeing here is some kind of authoritarian coup. And I wonder what your take is about the way this is framed, if you like. That really the big struggle in Tunisia is will it follow the authoritarian route or will it follow the democratic route?
One of the problems that we have, Rob, and we saw this in the case of Egypt as well, and the American ambassador in Cairo at the time, is that the West is somehow impotent to understand the reality of the street and the dynamics of people's wishes and minds. We saw in the case of Egypt, American ambassador constantly referring to what she called procedural, to the voting system and majority in parliament or voting system, not paying any attention to the call on the street, no matter how far the street or how strong the popular support is for a change, because the current system has failed. So, because the West is somehow only looks at the voting system as the only legitimate source of power, in the case of Egypt, they talked about that was a coup. In this case, there is a huge difference, and I tend to agree with your friend. First of all, the president is not, say, a defense minister. The president is a constituent part and structure of the political establishment in Tunis. He has been given, as your friend indicated, by the same constitution that gave power to the parliament and by default to Ghannouchi. He has been given the power once he sees that the government is, or the country is in a kind of slippery slope going into violence, to step forward and do something. The call on the street, the fact that Ghannouchi immediately after called this a revolution. But when he called his people out on the street briefly, he realized that there is a huge counter demonstration on the street against him.
Right.
He realized that this issue has changed compared to Egypt, and he has no alternative but to step tentatively around and see whether he has to make a deal with the president and allow him to make changes or to call people. The problem for him, if he calls his supporters, within a few days after what the president did, 80%, I mean, support on the streets of Tunis for
87%.
yeah
Almost 90%.
the president and his actions. And if Ghannouchi were to go ahead and call his troops out, we are going to go for civil war. He knows about that. So I would suggest that this notion of democracy, totalitarianism, they might be worthwhile, or at least a narrative that the Western pundits can sit in Washington or somewhere else and write an article based on it. It has no relevance whatsoever. We have a constitution. The constitution gives the president the right to take the necessary action, and that is democracy. There is no other alternative to it. And he has repeatedly from the beginning made it clear by putting his hand on the Constitution and by the authority of the Constitution, the chapter of the Constitution, he has taken the step. So I'm aware that democracy, however, is defined, and the totalitarianism, these kind of narratives are brought in. They don't work in the case of Tunis.
Okay. Yes. I want to just add a few things, and that is when I was in Tunisia in 2011, it was just after the Ben Ali clique had been overthrown, and I spent a lot of time. I have my own way of organizing, and I try to speak to as many people as possible and as many groups as possible. And the question that I posed is, what is your plan, because this is a socio-economic crisis, to address this crisis? I was really surprised and disappointed. And I spoke to people at many different levels of the Ennahda party. And it was quite clear to me they did not have an economic policy other than continuing the neoliberal trends of the past. And so basically what you had in 2011, it's true. You got rid of, quote, the bad guy and his clique, and who were awful, repressive, and stole incredible amounts of Tunisia's money over the years that they were there. But when you looked at institutionally what it was that how Ennahda hoped to reform the Tunisian economy, essentially there was nothing. There was no program. And so they really blew it, because they also had, in 2011, considerable sympathy. Islamicists had been repressed terribly, in fact. So they had that sympathy, and they could have, had they had a program, my sense is if they'd offered anything of any value to the people of Tunisia, that they would still be in power rather than the position that they're in now.
Wrong. They not only at the beginning 2011 they had sympathy because of their history. They received huge amount of money, particularly Tunisia. Huge amount of money at the time. What we call the Saudis versus Qataris and their bloc, Turkish bloc, and others had not been established. So they received huge amount of money from the Saudis and the Qataris and everybody else. And they instead of using that money to build the infrastructure that had been totally destroyed during Ben Ali, they spent it on getting rich and between the party members. The consequence is that, as somebody said, we have democracy on paper that we can talk about something, but we don't have a bread to
Right.
put on the table or health or job or anything else.
Okay, one more thought about on all this, and then I want to talk about what is to be done or what are the possibilities for the future. And that is, both Ibrahim and I, we were at the University of Denver's Korbel School of International Studies. He was getting his doctorate, and I was teaching there. And in the period before the Arab Spring took off, 2007, 2008, 2009, all that I would hear about was Turkey. And you could see that the United States was going to play this Turkish Muslim Brotherhood card. And that was really, really clear. And I mention this because this is not just a failure of the Ennahda government, but this is a failure of American policy in Tunisia, which really facilitated, if you like, politically facilitated the Ennahda's coming to power. All right. Having said that, Ibrahim, here we are. What are the possibilities of this crisis being coming to some kind of successful conclusion? Because right now we're still in full crisis.
Yeah, we are still at the early stage, but I don't believe the Tunisian president is going to capitulate.
Yeah.
If nothing else could be said about him, he is a strong supporter, nationalist in nature, supporter of Tunis, really cares about the crisis in Tunis. And he has made it clear from the beginning that he was elected that he would do everything possible to change the situation in Tunis. I don't believe he has the intention of becoming some kind of autocratic government or establishing autocratic government. I think at the end of the day, your question will be answered by Ennahda. Whether Ennahda is going to dig its heel and say no, either or, it's we have the procedural democracy and we are going to run and everybody else out, our way or highway, or which means continuing doing the same thing, or Ennahda is prepared to understand the reality that, by the way, as I was reading during the past 2 or 3 days, I have heard a number of voices within Ennahda that they have called that they need to go and apologize to the Tunisian and make a deal with the president because the benefit is going to be for the people. So now we're beginning to see the fracture appearing. If that happens, weakens Ghanouchi's position, we might be going in the right position, in the right direction. If no, then certainly it's going to be a crisis, and the role of United States and the European powers are going to be critical.
Yes. Here's my final thought on this. My final thought for now, anyhow. When I followed the election of Kais Saied rather closely, and I couldn't tell where he was coming from. And I have to admit, because I couldn't tell where he was coming from, I was really quite concerned, suspicious. Who is this guy who comes out of nowhere? And later watching him, there were a couple of things. First of all, when he came to power, he won in a landslide. The same kind of support that he's being shown now, he's given now, this 87% from the latest poll that stands with. I don't remember what the percentages were, but he won by something
over 60%.
Yes, it was really significant that somebody with who really had no public persona in the political arena in Tunisia could seemingly come out of nowhere and win. And later, kind of watching Tunisia and the events there. One of the things I concluded, this is exactly what the Tunisian people wanted. They wanted somebody new, somebody not tainted not only by Ennahda, but also those elements that were close to Ben Ali and who were also trying to find their place in this new system, and actually did to a certain degree. So he was somebody different. Now, having said that, the current crisis is going to be very interesting to see if he can address it. The fact that he has such extensive public support from where I'm sitting is very important and will help him make the changes that he needs to make. And I wish him well. I really, my respect for him as I've watched him has grown over time. He's a very interesting man. And you have to admit, trying to figure him out from Denver is a little bit hard. But watching him these past years, he's his own man. Having said that, at a certain point, and he's going to have to address the same socioeconomic crisis that the others failed to address, and that's really going to be the test of his administration. Ibrahim, you have any closing remarks you would like to make before we say goodbye to our audience?
No, I tend to just echo what you have said, but I would like to focus on, contrary to the statements floating around that this is religious or the other, the crux of the matter is socioeconomic.
That's right.
If the president is able to do something to address this crisis, I think he would write his name in the history of Tunis. If not, then we are going to slide down the crisis that we went through in Egypt, in Libya, in other places, and Tunis becomes another example for the failure of United States in the region.
Okay, well, we're going to follow this issue as we have up until now. We want to wish, we stand with the Tunisian people right now and with its president, and hope that the changes that are needed, that he's trying to make, that he can make them and that he can address these deeper issues as well. So thank you. Of course, thank you, Ibrahim, once again.
Thank you.
And dear friends, we'll be at this again sometime in the not too distant future. Bye-bye. Okay.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.